Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and introduction. I'm going to speak about the 18th century and what for botanists is perhaps the most famous figure in the 18th century, Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist and physician, who introduced binomial nomenclature and the Linnaean hierarchy. And the 18th century takes us into a very different world, I guess, from having read the papers that were submitted for this workshop. Food security was very much on the mind of 18th century botanists. Linnaeus, as we will see, collected a lot of information on so-called hardship foods, foods that one can consume when there's nothing else left to eat. But responsibility wasn't. It's my birthday today, and I got 2 volumes of Kant on ethics and political philosophy in English. Responsibility is not in the index, which did surprise me, actually. So there's no sense in someone like Linnaeus that they might be culpable of something in what they are doing. The category that works better perhaps is the category of duty. They have a sense that what they are doing is fulfilling some duty and some destiny. So this is just as a warning, so to speak, but we'll see whether some of the topics I will talk about will speak to the themes of this workshop nevertheless. Now, Linnaeus is, of course, always trouble making slides move when I share them. Okay, Linnaeus is, of course, known to us today. I mentioned that already for his taxonomy. And his taxonomy did provide botanists at the time, but also in subsequent generations with formidable tools of data linkage. I will say a little bit about that in a minute. Linnaeus is less known today, though not in the 18th century, as an explorer. He, as a field botanist as well. And in this, he followed clearly what one can call a colonial agenda already, especially in his travel to Lapland in 1732, on which I will focus. Lapland was in the process of being settled by the Swedish state. Settlers were enticed to go to Lapland and start agriculture there. And there's a very fine book by Lisbeth Körner, now again Lisbeth Rousing, about this agenda, entitled Linnaeus, Nature and Nation. And interestingly, this book also contains a kind of veiled critique of certain contemporary ideas of development that place emphasis on self-sufficiency, which for Linnaeus was also a value. He believed that a wealthy state is a self-sufficient, autonomous state that finds all the natural resources it needs within its own borders. So there's a lot of relevance here. But I move on to saying a few words about data infrastructure, the data infrastructures Linnaeus was using. These incorporated during his Lapland trip. From now on, I'm going to focus on his exploration of Lapland. These infrastructures did not only involve processing information on paper. That was the only available means for Linnaeus, but they were importantly, I skip a few slides here, they were importantly human-made infrastructures as well. Linnaeus's trip followed a very distinct format, so to speak, or outline. He traveled along the coast and then inland along rivers. And these were basically the only ways to travel. He was dependent on passports. So this is a nice picture of a statue of settlers in Sweden. He was dependent on passports for traveling through the Swedish provinces, but importantly also for entering what was then still more or less autonomous Sami territory, indigenous territory, if one wants. He was dependent on guides and translators. He wasn't ultimately dependent on people hosting him and actually also guiding him towards interesting features of the landscape, interesting plants and animals, the kind of things he was out to see. Now, how did he process the information that he acquired in this way? As I said already, he had to do this on paper, something we're not very used to anymore. He kept a journal during the journey, day-to-day observations, and he developed an elaborate system of numbering his observations, which then allowed him to draw up a paper index that made use of these numbers, which then later on helped him to systematically extract information from the journal and collate it in other publications, in print publications. For example, plants he encountered in the highlands of Sweden, Andromeda species. This is an Erica, genus related to Erica, very similar to Erica, are found then in Flora Laponica, a book he published in 1737. You have them here listed as number 18 and 19. And through the index, they find their way into Flora Laponica as numbers 163 and 66, with elaborate morphological descriptions, but also, interestingly, with an account of the natural, but also, interestingly, social context in which he encountered these plants. So he mentions in this description of the second species of Andromeda, he mentions the translator that accompanies him, Interprete, and this is a very rare Andromeda species, and it's not unlikely that this translator, this guide, actually pointed it out to him. He mentions that himself. Now, he also collects specimens, and these specimens in his herbarium then helped him to put together his grand oeuvre. Oops, my phone is ringing. It's my birthday, I'm sorry. The Species Plantarum in 1753. And what we observe in the Species Plantarum is an extreme form of abstraction. All the contextual information is now gone and has been sort of erased in the process of defining and collating species in a global catalog of species. Now, what I'm particularly interested in is how these taxonomic concepts that Linnaeus develops in order to process data on plants intersect with other kinds of taxonomies. For example, the fundamental distinction we make in our everyday lives between edible and inedible plants. And I want to conclude by just taking you very quickly through a kind of first case study of that. It concerns bark bread made from the bark of pine trees. That sounds horrible, but it is actually quite edible, and some find it delicious. It experiences a kind of renaissance. But when Linnaeus travels Lapland, the thing he mostly notes is that there are enormous forests of pine that are, as he puts it here, stand desolate and purposeless, because since no one needs the timber, it simply falls down and rots away. So that's his view as a kind of colonial agent of the nature that surrounds him. Basically, he sees it in terms of timber. But he is also, he actually has a whole section of his index devoted to the deserts of Lapland, deserti, which basically means wilderness in Latin. But he is also careful to note in some instances of his journal that trees are used, especially their bark, as food for cattle, but also in some areas as food for humans. And he sometimes characterizes it as food, famine food. Famines were a reality in the 18th century, a recurring reality in Europe. But sometimes also just reports that people seem to be quite routinely eating bread made from the bark of pine trees. And archaeologists have actually figured out that this reflects a long-standing practice, quite an extensive practice. So what from the point of view of Linnaeus looked like forests full of timber, from the point of view of the inhabitants of northern Scandinavia, is a kind of field that they also take care to preserve. So the trees are never damaged in a way that makes them die away immediately. You may have wondered, if you have been in woods like this, how it comes about that there are all of these holes in the trees, but that's the reason. I think I leave it here. I would like to expand this theme and see more closely and in detail how these intersections work. But it is clear that Linnaeus's vision of these forests as being timber constitutes a kind of clash with land uses that are sustainable and ongoing, and whole cultures depending on these natural resources. Thank you very much.